So let's get started. My name is JD Ross Leahy, and I'm one of the members of the Ecology Model Development Team. I'll be presenting today, although this presentation is a joint creation of the whole modeling team that you see listed here. I'll also be facilitating the discussion session that follows the presentation. I want to start by thanking you all for being here today. It's a really great turnout. Looks like we have more than 60 people signed on right now, and I'm sure more will trickle in as we go. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time. I'd also want to take a moment before we get started to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. And I'm grateful to be speaking to you all today, and I honor with gratitude the land and the Duwamish tribe. I know many of our tribal partners are here on the call today, and I appreciate all of your attendance as co-trustees. Thank you for being here. This event is the latest in a series of discussions that will take place throughout model development. And at our last event in July, we outlined our modular approach to the foundational model and laid out a basic description of the 4 modules that make up that approach. Today's presentation is focused on the first of those 4 modules, the vessel movement module. We'll describe the module in more depth, give you an update on the progress we've made in developing it, and highlight areas where we'll need your input to guide our decisions moving forward. Before we do that, we'll start with some brief background on the project for those who may be joining us for the first time. And from there, we want to talk briefly about some ideas we have for improving our ability to have dynamic discussions on some of the components that we're working on. Then we'll get into the details of the vessel movement module and give an update on our progress so far. I'll spend the first 50 or so minutes of the webinar presenting, followed by a discussion session. And we've allotted 60 minutes for that, and we're looking forward to questions and comments. I also want to be clear that today is not your only chance to provide input, in particular on components of the module that we'll be outlining and requesting additional feedback on. For questions we can't fully address today, we'll get answers out and post it on our webpage. Also, I want to let you know that I'm recording the presentation right now, and I'll be uploading this recording to the web. I'll also send out a link to all of these materials to everyone who registered for today's webinar. I also want to just be clear, we're recording the presentation, but I won't be recording the discussion session that takes place at the end. For the time that we have allotted for discussion, we have 3 main topics that we hope to hear from you on. And I have them up on the screen here so that you can be thinking about them as we go through the presentation. Of course, comments or questions on any aspect of the modeling effort are welcome, but we hope that these topics can help frame today's discussion. So we're interested in your thoughts on the structure of the vessel movement module as we presented it, the current status of our work on the module, and ways to improve upcoming discussions related to the vessel movement module. We're going to introduce a few new ideas today that we hope will make it easier for you to provide input, and we look forward to hearing your feedback on those. As many of you know from our previous presentations, the model development that we'll be discussing today is part of a group of measures passed by the legislature in 2019 that's designed to reduce the risk of oil spills and protect our southern resident killer whales. Specifically, the bill requires Ecology to build an oil spill risk model. The model is required to be able to, quote, quantitatively assess current and potential future risks of oil spills from covered vessels in Washington waters. And to accomplish this, the legislature provided funding for ecology to hire our modeling team. I want to just briefly reintroduce the team. At the top of the list, Adam supports the team with project management and database administration. Alex and Melba are our modeling experts and are leading the mathematical and statistical aspects of model development. And as I mentioned, my name is JD. I'm the ecology staff lead for outreach for model development, and I also provide technical expertise on maritime operations to the team. As we've discussed in our previous webinars, we're treating each step of model development as a research effort, and we're committed to a transparent approach that provides an open and inclusive feedback loop with tribes and stakeholders. We're also committed to using sound methodology and to documenting our work, and we believe that model validation is an important step in the development process, and we value the benefit that peer review can provide. And this research philosophy really shapes how we approach every one of our project tasks. The objective of the model development project is to create a tool that can be used to assess current and potential future oil spill risk. The tool must be able to complete the 2 future analyses that have been assigned to us by the legislature, but we're also making sure that we're designing a model that will provide a generalized framework for evaluating oil spill risk. We're building what we're calling a foundational model that's made up of a series of modules. We're using the word foundational to emphasize that we're building a model that can meet our near-term requirements, but also one that's organized broadly enough that it can be expanded to meet additional needs. Our approach provides a flexible framework so that our model is able to tackle a wide array of possible oil spill risk-related questions. Each module will deal with an element of determining oil spill risk. These elements include modeling vessel movements with the vessel movement module, then using the outputs to feed a vessel encounter module that measures and evaluates relationships between each vessel and the shore and other vessels. The accident module will evaluate situations for their potential to lead to accidents, and the oil outflow module will estimate spills from simulated accidents. Each one of these modules contains many components that work together to meet the needs of the module as a whole. Framing each module as being made up of a number of components is a helpful way to communicate which aspects of the module we're working on, and it also helps us organize opportunities for you to review and provide feedback on our work. Over the next 12 months, we have 2 of these webinars per module to individually discuss each one and get your thoughts on how best to solve the challenges that we face as we work on them. We're also providing updates during Harbor Safety Committee meetings and in conferences like the upcoming Salish Shared Waters Forum. We're committed to developing the modules in an open and transparent way with a structured plan to welcome your input at each step. But with a project this complex, we know our model will be improved by participation and input beyond the approach described in this slide. And since our last presentation, we've been working on some additional ideas for how to create opportunities for more in-depth feedback. The ongoing pandemic means we're unable to draw upon some of the historical strategies that have worked in the past, so we put our creative hats on and we've come up with some ideas we think will work, and we look forward to answering your questions and taking your input on these ideas during the discussion portion of today's webinar. We're open to making additional adjustments to figure out the best way forward. As we've continued our work building and specifying components of the vessel movement module, it's become clear that some components would benefit from additional opportunities for feedback. For these components, we'll provide a short summary document explaining the purpose of the component and specific questions to help you provide input. One of the challenges here, these topics can be technically intense, and we want to balance keeping things accessible and interesting while also getting into the back-end details. We'll post these summary documents on our webpage, and we'll email them out to our distribution list with a request for feedback. For some of these, we might request input from people that hold specific knowledge, although comments and suggestions, of course, are welcome from everybody. To collect and organize your feedback, we'll start using an existing ecology tool called e-comments. We'll have e-comment opportunities for each module component that we're asking for extra feedback on. But we're also aware that there's real value to group discussion. It can help clarify complex topics, and sometimes it's just good to hear other people's questions. So for components that are particularly complex, or where the right approach is not apparent to us, we'll schedule a technical input and discussion webinar. These will be in addition to the 2 presentation style webinars per module that we've shown you in our planning so far. We think 2 hours per technical discussion sounds right, but we can always end early if appropriate. And we plan to start these sessions in October. Rather than involving a long presentation, although I know that everyone is enjoying this one so far, our goal for these discussions is to be more conversational. And as a modeling team, we're hoping to get a lot of benefit out of these. Your involvement will be crucial in helping us get the details right. The summary documents I just described won't cover every aspect of the module. In order to do that, we'll need to produce a comprehensive document that describes the attributes and performance of the module as a whole. So we'll produce one of these for each module as we get there. And then once the drafts are complete, they'll be posted to the web and also shared out for written feedback via e-comments. It's clear that with the level of interest that we have in this model development project and the constraints of the pandemic, we needed some additional avenues for feedback. So in addition to the tools we presented here, we're open to suggestions for other ways to have meaningful technical discussions as we work through developing the model. So let's move on to digging into the primary reason that we're here today, to learn more about the vessel movement module and hear about our progress so far. So the purpose of the vessel movement module is to model maritime activity using AIS data, with the goal of simulating vessel activity and potential changes in traffic volume. To do this, we need to generate simulated AIS data to be able to evaluate the frequency distribution of possible or potential accidents. We can't just use past AIS data, because what we can observe in the past data is only one realized configuration of marine traffic. Small changes in the vessel speeds and courses, as well as in their arrival and departure times, may result in an infinity of other configurations of traffic that we didn't observe in the historical data, simply by chance. Simulating vessel movements allows us to produce enough data to reach conclusions based on patterns of vessel behavior. And we need to simulate that data in such a way that it remains consistent with the volume and type of vessel traffic that's represented in the actual historical AIS data, including the number of vessels, where they're going, where they came from, the type of vessels in the system, etc. It also needs to generate simulated data that's detailed. We need to have data that represents accurate movements, speed of the vessels, and appropriate distributions of the types and characteristics of vessels in different geographic areas. To do this, in its most bare bones form, the vessel movement module needs four things. It needs a geographic area with boundaries that define where the model will simulate vessels. It needs actual AIS message data so we can build our simulation. It needs to be able to group those AIS messages into tracks. And a track is a series of sequential points with a start and end point. And then it must aggregate those tracks into routes. And a route is a collection of tracks with the same origin and destination. There are some additional components of the vessel movement module that will help it go beyond this basic structure, but we'll touch on those a little bit later. First, let's start with the geographic area, represented on the map in yellow. To build our foundational model, we're starting with a fairly broad area. Basically, we want to assure that we're including the entirety of the VTS traffic separation scheme, and also make sure we capture vessel movements that happen outside of that system that may affect traffic within it. To that end, we're bounding the study area to the west with an arc approximately 20 nautical miles past the J buoy, and to the north with a line from the Noose Bay to Seychelles. This allows us to include the Canadian anchorages near Nanaimo, as well as the ferry traffic to and from Nanaimo. As a reminder, this is the geographic area for the foundational model. Analyses that we perform using this model will have specific study areas that may be smaller than the overall geographic extent shown here. We've already touched on AIS data a number of times in previous presentations. The key reminder right now is that AIS data comes in discrete sequential messages. For our movement module, our vessels need to move along a continuous path. They can't just jump from location to location based on historical messages. To generate these paths, we need to identify the individual tracks that similar vessels have used under similar conditions, going between the same origin and destination. What you see on the screen here is a simplified series of messages that belong to just one vessel over a period of time. AIS data is available from a number of different sources. The Coast Guard makes a version of their AIS data freely available, so we looked at that option first. One of the challenges we encountered was that the free Coast Guard data is averaged in 5-minute intervals. And in the image, you can see that for an area like Upright Head, where there's a lot of sharp turns, the loss of fidelity that comes from averaging results in a lot of tracks being shown as transiting over land. Now, the Coast Guard data here is shown in purple. The Marine Exchange data has a higher temporal resolution, and you can see the difference by comparing the blue tracks there. However, Marine Exchange and Coast Guard do use different receiving stations, so the other thing we wanted to look at was possible differences in geographic coverage. And what we found was that the Marine Exchange coverage was as robust as the Coast Guard data, and as a result, we've elected to go with the Marine Exchange data for this project. We've also come up with an approach for cleaning AIS data. We remove all entries that are missing things like the MMSI, which is a unique identifier that allows us to link the vessels to other vessel information. We remove vessel entries that consist of a very small number of transmissions. People call these ghost vessels. Many of them may be smaller vessels briefly transmitting while at the dock, but whatever they are, they don't add meaningful tracks to our database. We also remove duplicate points based on a set of rules, and this has a side benefit of facilitating the identification of track endpoints because stationary vessels produce a lot of what are essentially duplicate points. And lastly, we remove faulty points, like the one shown here, because they represent a navigationally impossible movement. As we mentioned previously, the AIS data is available as a series of discrete messages that represent the locations of a vessel at a given moment. In order to simulate vessel movement in our module, we need to identify the general pathways that vessels operate on within the traffic system. We need this so that we can represent simulated movement along similar paths. One challenge is that while vessels operate on similar pathways, the nature of the marine environment means that their specific path is almost always unique to that time and place. Also, different types of vessels take different paths, and the same vessel may take different paths depending on other external factors or conditions. We want to make sure that this variation is represented in our movement module. So we need to evaluate all the different pathways that a vessel takes between a given origin and a destination. We call these pathways tracks. A track is a series of sequential AIS messages with a start and end point, with each start and end point assigned to an origin or destination. To identify tracks within the data, we first need to determine a beginning and end of a series of AIS messages. Vessels don't turn off their AIS transponders upon ending a voyage or arriving at a destination. So we need to address this by defining an algorithmic strategy for identifying starting and ending points in the data. Our draft track identification algorithm is based on the track builder script that's available from the Marine Cadastre webpage. Tracks are created when our duplicate point deletion routine creates a lack of data for a period of at least 15 minutes. A new track is also created when a point appears more than 10 miles away from its preceding AIS message. This is generally an indicator of something like unreceived messages, or an AIS that has stopped transponding, or some other non-standard event. Here you can see linked AIS messages from one vessel over a period of time. After the application of our track creation algorithm, you can see that our algorithm found 7 different segments in the messages from this one vessel over this period. They're represented here in different colors. It looks like this vessel entered the system twice. On one visit, it just stopped at Port Angeles and then headed back to sea. And on the other visit, it stopped in Port Angeles, headed to March Point, went back and forth from March Point to a nearby anchorage, although you can't quite see that in the image here, and returned to sea again. Once we have individual tracks identified, we need to be able to group those tracks into meaningful routes. It wouldn't make sense to identify the 100,000 or 10,000 different unique transits between 2 green shapes on the screen as unique routes. Grouping tracks into routes allows us to validate traffic levels of our simulation, and it also allows us the flexibility to estimate changing traffic volumes and route selection that might result from changes in vessel traffic or commodities transported, which are both requirements for the model that were established by the legislature. To group tracks into routes, we need to assign each track start or end point, an origin, or a destination. In order to assign origins and destinations to the endpoints that were identified by the track algorithm, we've created a list of terminal locations and official and unofficial anchorages that cover both the US and Canadian portions of the waterway. And you can see the locations marked here with green diamonds on the map. Using this list, we've created a set of rules that identifies how a track endpoint should be assigned to one of these as an origin or destination. In the diagram, you can see two March point terminals represented as green diamonds. If the track endpoint for a given vessel is located within 200 meters of one of these diamonds, then we assign that terminal as the destination. Anchorages are represented here as striped gray circles or polygons. If the endpoint is within that striped gray area, or within a 200-meter buffer for that anchorage, shown in darker gray, then we assign that anchorage as the destination for the vessel. However, as you can see, and because of the example I chose here, these locations sometimes overlap. In those cases where a track endpoint is within the buffer zone of a terminal and an anchorage, we assume that the vessel went to the terminal. Sometimes the endpoints aren't within the buffer zone for any anchorage or terminal. And when that's the case, as long as they're still within a kilometer of the anchorage or terminal, we assign them whichever is nearest as their destination. As we mentioned, there are many unique tracks that vessels take between an origin and a destination. We can see here that even vessels grouped on essentially the same journey from sea to Port Angeles show the variability that we talked about. Once we've established the tracks, found their start and end points, and assigned them an origin and destination, then we can group them into what we call a route. A route is a collection of tracks, the same origin and destination. This slide shows the same tracks as before, but this time differentiated by vessel type. Within our vessel movement module, we want to recognize that different tracks within a route may be used for a variety of reasons. Here we show vessel type as a possible factor in track selection within a route. We can see that the ATB and the tug in yellow and light green are taking the two-way route for slower vessels, separating them from the tracks taken by the deep draft vessels that are utilizing the primary traffic separation scheme. If this trend were to hold, after looking at additional tug and ATB tracks along this route, that would mean vessel type would be a factor in track selection on voyages from sea to Port Angeles. Vessel type is one factor that we'll be using to examine variation in track selection, but there are other factors like weather or visibility that we expect to examine as well. So this represents the basic structure of the vessel movement module. AIS messages are cleaned up, assigned endpoints and starting points algorithmically, and then those starting and ending points are linked to origins and destinations. These represent tracks that vessels in the simulation will move on. Tracks with shared origins and destinations are collected into routes, and for the simulation, we'll select unique tracks for each vessel within a route, derived from the AIS-based empirical distribution of tracks within that route. Vessels may also be distributed on tracks within a given route based on factors like vessel type and potentially others like weather or visibility if supported by data. So what we've just gone over, the AIS data, the tracks and the routes, represents the basic foundation of the vessel movement module. These are the core concepts that we need to have under our belts in order to move forward. So thanks for sticking with it through the explanation. Now, I just want to encourage everyone to stand up from their chair. I'm going to too. We take a deep breath and just stretch just a little before we move into the next section. Maybe a deep breath too. Okay, so we have the basics down, but in order for the vessel movement module to represent something closer to the actual complexity of our waterway, we have to look at some additional pieces. These additional components, track selection factors, some external navigation rules, rules for dependent vessels, and a plan for vessels not transmitting an AIS signal, are the components that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we need additional input on. We're going to outline them today, but for each of these, we'll be producing a summary document that I talked about so that we can facilitate in-depth feedback from you via e-comment and also as part of the technical discussion sessions that we're planning. So for the vessel movement module to work, we need vessels with appropriate characteristics to be moving on routes that are appropriate for them, and to be moving on those routes in an appropriate distribution. There are a number of factors that could influence track selection by vessels in our simulation. Based on our understanding of the waterway, we're reasonably confident that vessel type will be a significant factor in track selection. An illustrative example is the use of the two-way route for slower vessels in the Strait of Juan de Fuca that we saw on the earlier slide. Slower, non-deep draft vessels will select these tracks more often than they select tracks within the main lanes. Statistical hypothesis testing will be used to test if and when vessel types have a significant effect on the track, speed, and course selection of vessels. In order to do the statistical work that will help us determine the influence of vessel type on track selection, we need to come up with a way to group vessels into meaningful types. We need to classify them within our system in a way that groups them based on the types of tracks they take. That means, for instance, that using existing AIS typology for example, passenger vessels won't be sufficient. There's too much of a difference between the tracks taken by cruise ships, ferries, whale watching boats, and harbor tours, all of which may fall under the same vessel type category in AIS. So to do this, we'll need to create a new vessel taxonomy. Many maritime data sets organize vessels into categories based on vessel type, but there's no unifying typology. There are many different ways to classify ships, and some organizations have made an effort to create standardized language, like for instance the BC Pacific States Oil Spill Task Force, but these efforts are not detailed enough to work for our purposes here. So we do have a draft vessel taxonomy created, and we look forward to your feedback and suggestions once we push out a summary document outlining our thinking. It's also worth noting that while we're talking right now about the influence of vessel type on track selection, vessel type will also come up again later in the model development process and will influence other aspects of the model as well. For other factors that might influence track selection, we'll rely on the data to determine which factors are meaningful. A number of researchers have examined a variety of potentially meaningful factors in the past, and based on experience, we might expect visibility or weather to influence track selection, but it's also possible that we find correlations between other factors in track selection, like the tides, presence of an escort, day of the week, or others. We'll look to you to provide additional ideas on which factors we should investigate as part of this. And again, statistical hypothesis testing will be used to test if selected external factors have a significant effect on the track, speed, and course selection of vessels. Vessels that operate in the Salish Sea are governed by a number of international US and Canadian regulations. These rules, in addition to other factors, result in the patterns of vessel movements that we see in historical AIS data. For example, larger vessels generally operate within the established traffic lanes and avoid the separation zones. Vessel operators use the collision avoidance rules to guide their decision-making when negotiating passing arrangements. By using historical AIS data to build our vessel movement module, that means we don't need to explicitly model this behavior through the creation of rules. Our module shows the actual paths that vessels take on the water and models them in that organic form. One benefit of this is allows us to account for those vessels that may not always follow the rules or maybe are operating in a unique way. But there are some rules that are situational enough that we need to model them independently. We can't just rely on historical movements to accurately reflect these in our model. And so here are the types of rules that we may need to model independently. New rules that might not be apparent in the historical data, rules that only come into effect during certain times of the year, and rules that are based on vessel interactions, for example, those that only come into play under specific circumstances. So here's a list of rules that we are currently thinking about manually including in the vessel movement module. There may be rules that we're missing, and we welcome input and suggestions on this. We're looking for feedback on rules you think we might need to add to the list, and also on how best to represent the impact that these rules would have on vessel behavior within the simulation. Another dynamic component of the vessel movement module is vessels whose movements are dependent on the behavior of other vessels. Escort tugs only run out to escort a tanker if a tanker is arriving. Bunkers are only delivered to anchorages that are occupied by vessels that are in need of bunkers. To represent this type of vessel movement, we can't rely solely on AIS data. We need to produce a series of rules that outline which vessels need escorts, pilots, bunkers, where they need them, and when. In addition, we have to come up with a strategy for representing the movements of the dependent vessels before and after they provide their service. Where did they come from and where they're going? And this is an area where we welcome your help as well. The vessel movement module relies heavily on AIS messages. AIS is a powerful data set for the type of work we're doing, and it provides tremendous insight into vessel movements. But not all vessels carry or broadcast AIS. And that means that in order to represent them in the module, we have to estimate their numbers, characteristics, and tracks with some other strategy. So for this topic, we've yet to settle on a path forward, and we welcome your creative solutions to this multifaceted challenge. So as I'm wrapping up the presentation today, I want to review where we're at in the process of building the vessel movement module. So far today, we've focused on describing the structure of the module. This flow diagram allows us to visualize how the pieces that we talked about today fit into the step-by-step process that we're following as we build this tool. Some of the components that we talked about come into play right away, and some won't be needed until a little further down the road. This chart is a little too large for this slide, so I've broken it down into two parts. The first half of the chart shows the topics we've discussed today. We've started the process of acquiring AIS data, first by selecting Marine Exchange as our data source, and we're starting with just a single month's worth of data, which we will use to test our draft approach to data cleaning and track and route creation. Once we have our algorithms down, we will acquire more data and see how they do with a larger data set. We are in the process of testing our data cleaning strategies, and this is the AIS data component that we talked about today. We're also testing our algorithms for the track identification component and our algorithms for the route identification component. For the track selection component, we have a draft approach for how we want to lay out our vessel taxonomy, but we will need your feedback before moving forward with that step and before moving forward with the rest of the track selection factors that make up that component. The second half of the chart goes into the details around the statistical analysis of the routes and the need to add our additional rules that we talked about today. There's some detail here that goes beyond what we focused on, but I want to highlight on this slide where the last three components that we discussed today fall in the process that we're working from. You can see that the components related to external rules, dependent vessels, and vessels not represented by AIS come into play a little later in the process. So we have a little bit more time to dig into these in depth. Before getting to those aspects of the module, we need to first complete the import of the larger AIS data and complete our track and route identification work. And we hope to use this flow chart to show our progress over time on the key components of the vessel movement module as we work through it. So as you can see, there's a lot to talk about with this module. In addition to the discussion that we're about to move into today, we'll be creating these summary documents for the listed components and reaching out for feedback on those. As each summary document is completed, we'll send out invitations to the technical discussions as well. You can see the plan dates here for planning purposes, and our communication will include links and instructions for providing comments and feedback via e-comment. We'll also get the link to e-comment up on the risk modeling webpage for convenience as well. In terms of upcoming events, we have a brief update planned for the next Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee meeting on October 7th. And we'll also be presenting an update on our modeling effort as part of the Salish Sea Forum, which will take place October 14th and 15th. We have our next webinar in the series planned for November 18th from 1 to 3 Pacific time. This event will be a follow-up presentation on the vessel movement module. We'll summarize our progress and decision-making around module components, and we'll talk through what work remains and the next steps towards completion. There will also be an opportunity to provide feedback and input on the specifics of the module, and we're looking forward to having you all there.